started as a protest and soon became a movement, exposing deep divisions within our country.
Time to go home! Time to go home!
Today marks 1 year since a convoy of big rigs paralyzed Ottawa and inspired similar protests right across the country.
We don't want to take the jab.
Canadians don't want mandates.
It became known as the Freedom Convoy, sparked by indignation over vaccine mandates and COVID lockdowns. And its message attracted Canadians from all walks of life, many of them united by anger.
I'm okay getting arrested, yep. And if they really got to it, I mean, I've lived a good life.
With the streets overflowing with protesters, some residents were afraid to go outside. Others were forced to close their businesses, and some just left the city.
It's very stressful, and it's very this is the only thing that's taken up our minds.
As the protests grew, so did the grievances. What started as a rejection of pandemic policies soon morphed into a rejection of the federal government altogether, some going as far as to question its legitimacy.
Why don't they come out there and at least talk to the drivers? You got no balls if you can't come out of that goddamn building and talk to people.
But before the honking could be put to an end, drastic measures had to be taken, and the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act, a first in this country's history, unleashing a wave of unprecedented police action. For the next half hour, we will hear from the people who were there, discuss the political impact on this country, and look at how things have changed 1 year later. But first, here's how it all unfolded.
It's a movement that will last a long time. It will be talked about forever.
Unity is what we need in this country, not separation, right?
We are literally begging for your help. We're begging for any kind of action.
Call it a siege because that's what it is. It's an illegal occupation.
Bring it on, Doug Ford.
We've got a problem with nobody wanting to make decisions, nobody wanting to come forward and actually act.
If the police have a strategy, it sure as heck isn't obvious to us.
Today, in these circumstances, it is now clear that responsible leadership requires us to do this.
Did Chief Slowly quit, or was he fired for what's happened in the city?
I think you can appreciate, David, that that's a labor relations issue.
Those events, those scenes on Parliament Hill last year culminated into a public inquiry specifically on the use of the Emergencies Act. Now, Ashley Burke was one of our reporters who covered the convoy right from the start, and she joins us today again from Parliament Hill. What's going on there today, Ashley?
Well, Natasha, the atmosphere here is a bit tense right now. You can see these are the organizers right behind me, and they just had a little bit of a confrontation with police. They're upset that they weren't allowed to put the Canadian flags in the snowbank. You can see right behind me here in front of Parliament Hill. Police had told them, please remove them. They were also asking the demonstrators stay off the street. Take a look. This is Wellington Street. Remember last year? This is where all of those trucks were packed and shutting down the downtown core. You can see we've got police, Ottawa police behind us here. In the distance, there are also gates that are blocking off the area, the building where MPs right now, Liberals and Conservatives, are holding their caucus and meeting ahead of Parliament's return next week. Tours here in Parliament Hill, they've been cancelled. Just take a look about the size of the crowd. I would say there are dozens of people here so far, and organizers are expecting that to build throughout the day. The message here and the tone is very much, even though that mandates have been dropped, people are still expressing frustration with the government, and that's why they're meeting here today. Natasha?
CBC's Ashley Burke in Ottawa. Thank you, Ashley. So as we reflect on the events from a year ago, we want to get a perspective on what the protests were actually all about. David Henry is a long-haul trucker and a freelance writer for Today's Trucking to find out if the issues that were being protested have resolved or they continue to remain today. David, thank you so much for joining us. I want to make a note that you did not participate in the convoy protest, but you know many who did. So a year later, describe to me, what were their grievances and have they been addressed?
I don't think they have been addressed yet. It's unfortunate that we're still having to deal with lack of respect and deal with lack of conditions that are human for truck drivers. And if you want a good example, there's a new trucking organization that just started up that last weekend got 1,000 people to show up. And it's an inclusive group, and they feel that the trucking organizations have not been listening to them. So that's why they're still trying to get the message heard from truck drivers, and it doesn't seem to be helping.
What is the message, David?
The message is that we want to be treated like people. We want to be paid for our time away. We don't want to be discriminated against because we're long-haul drivers. When the mandates were on, and it was really tough to get anything done. And we were isolated. We're our own island driving around the whole time. It was not fun.
You know, we reached out to a number of truckers, people who attended the protest, people who spoke to us last year, and all of them refused. And there was this real sense of distrust. We know that there was frustration with the media, with generally public institutions, including both the government and the scientific community. What is creating this sense of distrust, David?
It starts at the top with Trudeau. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. And I don't agree with what happened in Ottawa, but I do agree with the right to protest and to do it peacefully. I have my own opinions about how things went down, and I wouldn't be there myself. But I think if Trudeau would step up to the table and start talking to people instead of, and everybody listen to each other. We need to talk to each other. We need to have different views. We need to look at different things. I'm not afraid to talk to you or to talk to anybody because that's how we are supposed to function as people, is to talk to each other and learn what we can do for the betterment of everybody, not just for ourselves.
David Henry, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now we want to reach out to an Ottawa resident to find out what things were like a year ago. Tim Abrey is a downtown Ottawa resident. Tim, take me back to January of 2022. What was it like to live through those protests, not only as a resident, but as a dad?
Well, it was exhausting and worrying. You referenced it right off the top. I mean, the entire reason that I got embroiled in this in the first place is because I do have a daughter who attends a high school that's just a couple of blocks down from where we live, but right on the edge of where a lot of this activity was happening, at Confederation Park on the edge of Parliament Hill. It was a exhausting, tiring, confusing, sleep-depriving time. It was a very, very difficult month of our lives.
Talk to me about the noise.
The noise was bad. To be honest, I mean, the noise was particularly excruciating for people who were right on the edge of this. We're a few blocks away. We're in what was commonly known as the red zone, but a little bit insulated. But nonetheless, we heard those horns all night long. We heard them throughout the day. Until at least the injunction was put in place. It was excruciating. But I think the thing that was even more concerning was the way in which our neighborhood turned into an abandoned place. It was very difficult to get in and out of the neighborhood. Services would not come in and out of the neighborhood for fear of safety. So taxis, Uber drivers, food delivery services, pharmacy delivery people, paratranspo, all kinds of things we rely on every day just couldn't get in and out of the neighborhood.
So Tim, let me ask you this then. Forgive me for jumping in, but then, so let me ask you, what do you think of how the police, the city, and the federal authorities handled this thing?
Well, they handled it terribly. They were very slow to respond. They seemed to be sitting back waiting for someone else to do something about it. And in the meantime, we had an entire neighborhood that was being terrorized and people unable to live their lives. We're used to protests, but this was not a protest.
Do you think what happened a year ago has changed the city?
I think so in some ways. I think it's easy to forget these things over time if you weren't living on the edge of them. But for people who live downtown, we won't forget it, that's for sure. And we're hoping that the city and its institutions have learned their lessons and will be better prepared in the future. But we'll wait and see. There's not a lot of trust left.
Okay. Tim Abray, thank you so much for your time.
Most welcome.
As we mentioned, the Ottawa convoy inspired similar demonstrations across the country, like this one in Windsor, Ontario. Protesters blocked the Ambassador Bridge, one of Canada's busiest border crossings, for nearly a week. Some estimate that it stopped $3 to $6 billion worth of goods from crossing the border. A similar scene unfolded at the border crossing at Coutts, Alberta. About 100 trucks lined up along the highway, which prevented some area residents from getting to the nearest grocery store, gas station, or even pharmacy. And today, a convoy is once again heading for that border. That's where we find our own Aaron Collins.
Dozens of vehicles have returned to this frigid highway in southern Alberta. It's a year since trucks blocked the border to the U.S. here on Highway 4 south of Lethbridge, a protest that lasted nearly 3 weeks. Now, the point of that blockade was to protest vaccine and mask mandates here in Alberta and across Canada. A year later, organizers of this protest say they were largely successful. Today's rally is to celebrate those successes, but there's a bit of a different purpose too. Organizers say people have gathered here today to show support for 4 men who were arrested last year in Coutts and accused of conspiring to murder RCMP officers.
These men did not hurt anyone. It is all speculation. Until it's proven otherwise, it is speculation. And they need to be allowed to have their rights really taken seriously.
So those 4 men who authorities have accused of stockpiling weapons at last year's blockade and planning to use them against RCMP officers are still in jail awaiting trial. 2 of those accused are being held near here in Lethbridge. And the plan for later today is for those vehicles to drive by the jail where they're being held, honk their horns, and show their support. All 4 men accused of conspiring to murder RCMP officers last year are set to go on trial in June.
I want to be here and have my voice heard. Not just my voice, everybody's voice to be able to be heard. Because the reality is if you're an adult, you should be able to make the decisions that are in your best interest.
Welcome back to our special coverage marking 1 year since the first trucks started rolling into Ottawa. CBC reporters on the ground spoke to many truckers during that time, and one of those reporters was our Travis Danraj. He was the man you just saw climbing into Mike Johnson's truck there and doing that interview live. Travis is joining us now from Toronto, where he is based. Travis, I remember that interview. I want to go back to that time. And you were right in the thick of it. I mean, in between the trucks, right in the middle of the streets. What was that like for you?
You know, it's wild, Natasha. I didn't even realize it was a year until, the producers asked me to come and chat with you about it. And I hadn't seen that clip since I did the interview live here on CBC News Network. I am taken back into that moment. I'm taken back to Arnprior in Ontario, where, there was a staging area where the truckers were going to meet up and then come into Ottawa for what was supposed to be a weekend, what police thought would be a weekend, but a lot of the truckers thought that they were going to stay there for the long haul. There was this sense of unity. People were gathering to, defend what they said were their fundamental rights and freedoms. And there was this bit of a carnival atmosphere at the very beginning of the weekend. I remember, interviewing people and they were very happy to be there. Obviously, they were breaking laws, but there was this sense of unity. There, you can see, some of them thanking the truckers here, and these pictures were, with a lot of people kind of getting along. That shifted. There was a distinct shift later on that week, even into the next weekend, where things got a little bit darker. Some of the people that were there initially left. And I look at this with two lenses, Natasha. You know, I lived in the middle of it. I lived right in downtown Ottawa, and I was also covering this as a journalist. I remember, you know, when there were horns blaring, I asked police as a citizen, like, why aren't you doing anything about this? And the police officer rolled up the window on me. We now know that there was a lot of disagreement around how policing should be handled, but there was a lot of anger from residents, and that progressively got worse. Next to the building that I lived in Ottawa, you know, there was a barbecue set up. There were fireworks going off. There were horns going on all the time. So it definitely got darker, and some of that anger was directed towards media, and it got a little bit dangerous for us as well.
Talk to me about that, because we did see a lot of that anger, a lot of hostility, and how did that impact the way you worked during that time, and has it changed the way you work moving forward?
I remember being on air with you, actually, and I remember that you were the anchor, and obviously you couldn't see what was going on around me. But I remember we had security, and we were at a staging area where some of the trucks had parked and they were refueled and people ate there. It was a ways from Wellington Street in front of the Parliament buildings. But we were doing a live hit. I was chatting with you, and we got surrounded. And there were people that were very upset, particularly with the CBC, and I had to stop the hit, and security pulled us out. I remember another time our crew was followed back to our broadcast center in Ottawa, so it definitely got dangerous. A colleague of ours at another network, a former colleague, had a frozen beer can tossed at his head. So, you know, it definitely changed. From the first weekend to, you know, further on, my sense of it at the beginning was, I'm going to talk to these folks and hear their perspective. I remember distinctly an individual that I met, and he said, you're not going to put what I'm saying on the air. He watched the story on the National the next day, and he said, you know what, you've changed my perspective because you actually did put my views on. But increasingly, when our safety was compromised as journalists, it definitely did impact how much we were able to be out there and cover it, even though we, you know, were trying to do our very best in a very precarious situation to get what was happening on the streets of Ottawa out to the people across this country.
Trav, how do you think it's changed the conversation, the landscape in this country after having gone through this incredibly divisive experience of the protests?
I think that a lot of people in this country, up until that moment, up until there was this, you know, stalemate on Wellington Street in front of Parliament with the backdrop of Canadian government behind all of these trucks, people thought that that could never happen in this country. That was going to happen somewhere else. Well, now I think, you know, the calculation has changed, and the way we look at political protests, the way policing is done in Ottawa, you know, you talked about the hearings that happened, some of our reporting around what was going on behind the scenes when it comes to policing was brought up in those hearings. So I think it has definitely changed the dynamic, you know, how people view political protests in this country and what potentially could happen. This basically shut down the city, the core of Canada's capital, for weeks. And it was, you know, very frustrating as a resident, but also, you know, as a journalist, it gave me insight in terms of how this could happen in our country. So I think we have to be mindful, and I think that it is good that folks are taking stock a year later in terms of what happened and what could be down the road.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights, Travis.
Thanks, Natasha.
Okay, as Travis mentioned, a lot of this had to do with how the police were managing the situation as it was unfolding in Ottawa. We often had to turn to policing experts to help us navigate through the coverage and what we were watching and how it was all unfolding. Well, Michael Kempa was there. He was one of those voices right along with us through the whole time, and he joins us once again. So, Michael, good to have you back. I want to begin with getting your sense of the big takeaways for both policing and public governance a year after those protests.
Natasha, the biggest one really was we cut through the ambiguity now on what operational independence means. For a long time, police have been very reluctant to share any operational plans, even with their civilian oversight bodies. This has caused a lot of problems in the past around Ipperwash in the late 1990s. the G20 summit in Toronto in 2010, and here at the Freedom Convoy, we've learned those lessons, and we now see that police organizations have learned they must work with their boards to develop these plans, share information, accept questioning about whether or not their plans are adequate, so that we really kick the tires on things and put the best things on the ground. We're also asking some very serious questions about the relative responsibilities of provinces and municipalities, and we're not quite there yet. We'll wait on the report of the Public Order Emergencies Commission and their recommendations, and we must act on those things quickly.
Okay, we might touch on that in a bit, but what I wanted to also ask you about is the fact that this sense of anger and frustration with public institutions hasn't gone away. In fact, our colleague Ashley Burke is on Parliament Hill today. There's a protest again to mark the one-year anniversary. There's protests taking place in other parts of the country. And just this week, when the Prime Minister was in Hamilton, there was a lot of anger directed at him again. Beyond just simple protesting, it's a sense of real rage and division there. What's going on? Are we still as divided today as we were a year ago?
Well, the big divisive issue of vaccine mandates and many of the measures that government felt they had to take to keep society safe and to prevent the medical system from collapsing under the weight of COVID are now gone. So the tens of thousands of very angry people have a little bit evaporated, leaving behind perhaps thousands that are very angry about more general issues. So for the last year, we heard from the Freedom Convoy leadership that the protests were only ever about vaccine mandates. But in the last few weeks, we've heard changing messages from different streams of that leadership saying, actually, it was never only about vaccine mandates. It was always about government overreach. It was always about the overemphasis of experts in governing our lives rather than leaving it to us and families. Other issues are popping up now. We hear talk about developing a parallel society where those who were not vaccinated would have their own economy and their own media and so forth. This is very different and a much more radical message. It attracts far fewer Canadians, but those that it does attract are that much more committed to those more radical causes.
And is that dangerous?
It is, not in the sense that you've got a number of people who would ever actually be able to overthrow the state, say, by putting together some kind of militia. The thing is, as they circulate these messages, they become more normalized. They're working on recruiting more and more people to their cause, spreading disinformation and so forth, as a means of raising resources, financial, political influence, community status, and so forth. Over time, where we have more and more people who are being socialized into these types of ideas, you have a problem for unity in society, a situation where ordinary democratic institutions like the police or the voting system or the elected government and so forth cannot do their business because they have too many people who are angry with them and causing disruption.
Michael Kempa, thank you, as always, for joining us.
Thank you kindly.
Well, that is our special presentation marking 1 year since the trucker convoy protests. I'm Natasha Fateh. There's still much more to come on CBC News Network. And before we head to break, here are some more of the sights and sounds of those demonstrations from 1 year ago.